Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started with our webinar. The Mountain Plains Prevention Technology Transfer Center at the University of Utah is excited to welcome you to our 6-part webinar series, Informing Prevention, with an emphasis on adolescents. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our website at pttcnetwork.org/Mountain Plains. Slides will be available in PDF format and posted on our website as well. For those of you interested in a certificate following today's webinar, please email mountainplains_pttc@utah.edu. We are an approved NAIADAC provider. For all other licensure and credentials, please apply directly to your board. All participants have been muted. We encourage you to use the chat feature for questions and messages. Following the webinar, you will see a link in the chat feature along with a QR code to complete a survey. The survey is required for all training events funded by Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They want to know how well we provide our services, and we want your feedback to help us improve our trainings. The information you provide is confidential. We ask that you please take a few minutes to complete the GIPRA evaluation form. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Glenn Hansen. Dr. Hansen received his DDS from UCLA in 1973 and his PhD in pharmacology from the University of Utah in 1978, and completed a fellowship in neuropharmacology in 1980 at the National Institutes of Health. He practiced dentistry full and part-time for over a 10-year period. Dr. Hansen is a tenured full professor of pharmacology and vice dean in the School of Dentistry. He was the acting director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the National Institutes of Health and recognized as a leading expert on the neurobiology of the psychostimulants. Dr. Hansen has given several hundred presentations around the world on his research and program development related to drug abuse and the public health implications. He also has testified multiple times before the United States Congress and the state of Utah legislature on issues of drug abuse policy and Medicaid dental strategies, and is frequently interviewed by local and international press about these topics. He is a member of the State of Utah Legislative Advisory Committee on Drugs of Abuse. He is the author of over 240 peer-reviewed scientific papers, 13 editions of a textbook entitled Drugs in Society, and has been awarded over $35 million in NIH grants to conduct research related to drug abuse and its treatment. I'll now turn the time over to Dr. Glenn Hansen.
Thank you, Taylor. It's my pleasure to join you and participate in this webinar series that are talking about prevention, especially as it relates to the adolescent. And in today's discussion, we're going to focus on adolescent brain development and hopefully sort out some of the issues why the adolescents are such a primary target for these drugs. And because of some of their neurobiology, they are particularly susceptible. And then we're also going to integrate into that a discussion of marijuana. One of the reasons marijuana, 90% of the time, its use is initiated in adolescence. And of course, marijuana is a major discussion point throughout this country in various states regarding medical marijuana, legalization. About half the states are already somewhere in that process. And by understanding some of its neurobiology and pharmacology, perhaps we can better assess what to expect in the future as these programs are initiated and they're implemented. So I just want to acknowledge at this point NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, and SAMHSA, which was mentioned by Taylor, the blending initiative, which played a major role in the development of some of these programs, and the Adolescent blending team, which also has participated in putting some of these adolescent programs together. The ATTCs, which we partner with, we are a Prevention Technology Transfer Center, but we work closely with the Addiction Technology Transfer Centers as we put these programs together, and we appreciate their support and their counsel. And then also I want to acknowledge the University of Utah, which is my home base as well as the home base for our Prevention Technology Transfer Center. And the two entities, the Department of Educational Psychology and the School of Dentistry, these are the departments and the colleges where most of our efforts are housed. And then, of course, I want to thank all of you, the webinar participants, one for working in an area that is very, very important in our society and culture today. Many of you are pioneers as well as you're on the front lines as we try to address problems of drug abuse, especially in adolescence, which is the topics that our webinar programs are addressing. But you see what is going on. You have to deal with some of the challenges that occur, things such as the opioid epidemic that we're struggling with now, and as I mentioned, the movements for marijuana to be implemented and accepted as medications and ultimately even as recreational drugs in a legal fashion. We appreciate your being here, and hopefully this experience will be of some value to you in executing your responsibilities and achieving your objectives. So let's move forward. I've already been introduced. The title of this presentation is Substance Use Disorder, the Adolescent Brain in particular, and then looking at the reasons why these two things tend to go together. And it's a very complicated topic. There are a lot of elements that could be addressed, but I'm going to take it more from the neurobiological perspective, and you can kind of put in some of the behavioral elements that I don't have time to address, and hopefully you can appreciate how they overlap with each other and they work together. Let me start off just by a quick definition, and I know you're all tired of hearing the definition about drug abuse and substance use disorder. But my approach, I think, is just a little bit different. You won't find this in DSM-5, but the reason I put it up here is because it underscores the neurobiology that we're going to talk about. It gives you a context in which to put that neurobiological information. So my definition, at least for the objectives of this presentation, is that SUD, or addiction, is a disorder of pathological decision making. So at the end of the day, it is part of a spectrum. It is part of other issues that relate to poor decision making. Substance use disorder rarely stands alone. It's a tip of an iceberg. And when decision making is disrupted for whatever reason, it could be genetic, it can be biological, it can be traumatic, it can be pathological, it could be chemical, whatever it is disrupting that process. The expressions are things such as compulsive behaviors and behavior that is very destructive and negative and ends up with bad consequences as a result. So as I said, drug abuse is the tip of the iceberg. There are other pieces of this that typically show up as well. Oftentimes these folks wrestle with antisocial behavior because of this bad decision making. Violence is frequently an expression of some of these drugs and their SUD counterparts. People who commit violence or involved in violent behavior, they oftentimes end up in our criminal justice systems. So if you look at jails, prisons, you'll find that well over half of the inmates have a background of SUD in one way or another. So you can see there are a lot of elements here. And if I said, okay, let's address the drug abuse piece of this and the rest of it will go away, well, it may mitigate the rest of it, but rarely does the rest of it go away. So oftentimes, if we're going to deal with the whole package, we got to figure out why is decision-making, why has it been damaged, why isn't it being performed in an appropriate fashion, and hopefully get to the core of all the symptoms, and drug abuse is one of those symptoms. So this process is very complicated. It's very complex, and it's difficult for people to understand, and we don't have the time to go into all of the details that are out there. It would take a PhD degree in order to understand a small piece of what this world looks like. But I want to give you a flavor, especially as it relates to adolescence, since that's the theme today, and help you understand why this population is particularly vulnerable in the process. So kind of killing two birds with one stone. So what biology do you need to know in order to understand what I'm going to talk about? Basically, and it's something I think all of you already are aware, and that is that every drug abuse or substance abuse has an impact on the dopamine neurotransmitter system. There is, as far as I'm aware, there is no exception to this rule. Now, it may not be a direct impact. It may be indirect through other neurotransmitter or other neurological systems, but at the end of the day, the dopamine pathways are impacted one way or another. Now, dopamine has been related to pleasure, although recently there's been some discussion or controversy as to what that means. Is it because dopamine's involvement in pleasure that it seems to be the central feature of substance use disorder discussions? Or is it some of the other elements, other things that dopamine does that could also be part of this? For example, it's also involved in cognitive function, it's involved in decision making, it's involved in perseveration, compulsive behaviors. All of these are elements of substance use disorder. So is the alteration of dopamine activity by these drugs, is that because of these other things, besides, in addition to, or maybe in spite of the effects on dopamine and pleasure? And I'm guessing it's probably everything. They're all of them contributing. It goes back to the statement I made before. It is complex. It's very complicated. And I have talked to literally thousands of people who are in various aspects of substance use disorder. And I've had a chance to interview some of them in significant detail. And I've never seen a person who has SUD, I've never seen the expression, the symptoms identical to somebody else's. They're all unique because we're unique people. Our neurochemistries are unique. Our neurobiology is unique. And so the expression of SUD is unique. That doesn't mean there aren't certain elements and certain features that are fairly common. They certainly are, but at the end of the day, we all have unique issues. Now, dopamine's not the only game in town either. Many other transmitter systems play a role here, and I'm only going to mention one of those here as I show you this cartoon. So this is a side view of the brain, and what we're looking at here, and this is a figure that the National Institute on Drug Abuse has used on their website in the past. This shows the dopamine system, and the dopamine system starts down here in the midbrain region. So this is kind of where the cell bodies are, and they project forward for the most part. And they go into a lot of different structures. And dopamine is impacted in all of these. And then another cell body area is here called the substantia nigra, and it also projects forward and includes all of these components. So you can see there's a lot of places where if dopamine release or activity is influenced, that brain function is going to be disrupted. It's not just pleasure, and pleasure is right in here. The pleasure pathway is right there. but it's going to also affect all these other areas. Frontal cortex is about behavior, management of decision making. Hippocampus is about memory. Striatum is about perseveration and compulsive behaviors, as well as motor activity. So all of these things get affected. So at the end of the day, we see this stuff being altered in individuals who suffer from SUD: reward, pleasure, motor functioning, compulsion, perseveration, and decision making. Like I said, there are other transmitter systems that are also involved, and the one that I want to mention is the serotonin system, and it's one that most of us are familiar with, and it also is back here, down kind of in the midbrain region. We call it the raphe area, and those project forward. Here's the raphe down here. Those project forward into the same areas that dopamine goes. So they talk with each other a lot. They interact with each other, and we have many of our drugs of abuse target, in addition to the dopamine piece, they target serotonin, which does these kinds of things here: mood, memory, sleep, and cognition. So you can see a lot of stuff is happening in people that use these kinds of drugs. And again, this is only 2 transmitter systems. There are literally maybe even up to 100 different transmitter systems that are affected in different ways. But we're not going to do all those today because we only have 50 minutes. But I just pointed out 2 of the main ones. So at a neurochemical level, you can see what's going on here with SUD. So where are we? What does the most recent surveys say relative to the adolescent use of drugs? And this comes out of Monitoring the Future surveys 2018. So it's the most recent that has been put out there. And a brief summary, this sort of shows you what we're looking at in terms of the illicit drugs. Here are the illicit ones. Alcohol, of course, is legal, but it's more, a lot of people don't like to think of it as a drug, but they will accept the fact that it's a substance. What the difference is, who knows? But so I put it up here in the substance category. And then there's the prescription drugs that also cause problems. And between you and me, the body can't tell the difference. It doesn't know whether you got this off the streets, whether you got it legally, or whether you got it from your physician or prescriber and you took it to the pharmacy. As soon as it gets in the body, it is pharmacology, and pharmacology has no designation as legal or illegal. So these are indications of the use patterns for 2018. Alcohol, as I'm sure all of you know, is the number 1, so about 50%, and it's the number 1 for high school kids as well, and these are seniors. So about half of them have used alcohol in some fashion or other. And then the illegal drugs, more than 1/3 of them have been using illegals. And then marijuana looks a lot like the total of all the illegals. It's not quite up to alcohol, but it's kind of pushing up in that general direction. Prescription drugs are kind of clustered down here in the 3, 4, 5, 6% region. And you can see the narcotics, which is a big theme today because of the narcotic epidemic. About 6% have used prescription narcotics in an illegal way, an illicit way, not because they were prescribed, but because they got a hold of them, got them from a friend, or stole them out of a medicine cabinet, however else they got a hold of them. So that gives you a sense of what that looks like in general. But there's a very interesting pattern that has occurred this last year, and it has to do with the way these drugs are being administered. I mean, nicotine, tobacco, has been around for centuries, and we've just started to pay a lot of attention to it in the last half century. But we're now exposing people to nicotine in a way that is a little different versus getting the natural nicotine. from the produced nicotine, which, as I said, the body doesn't care whether it's coming out of a tobacco plant or whether it's coming out of a vaping machine or a vaping device of some sort. But there has been this increase in nicotine exposure from vaping, not from tobacco use, but from vaping. But this is a great concern. It's gone from, in the last 30 days, in this last year, from 11% who vaped nicotine to 21%. That's almost a doubling of nicotine use through vaping mechanisms. That is an issue that we're going to have to address in the future, and it's very worrisome for us. And these are 12th graders. I mean, these are adolescents that are doing this thing. And then marijuana, we're seeing the same kind of thing, interestingly enough. The vaping mechanism introduction has done the same thing, that in the last year, once at least 30 days prior to this survey, it's gone from about 5% to up over 7% increase in marijuana vaping. So in this case, the drug hasn't changed, but the drug delivery has changed, and it's had a big impact on the use pattern of these drugs. And if they're using more of the drugs, it's going to have a neurobiological consequence in the future. So this is just a quick slide. This comes from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And it just gives us some summary about marijuana, daily marijuana use. And this is the scary piece of marijuana. There's a lot of belief out there that casual use of marijuana is not hurtful. It's not a big problem for us. And that's probably true. If you casually use this drug, there isn't a lot of evidence that there's going to be long-lasting consequences. I won't say that it's impossible that there won't be any damage with it. There's always going to be someone who's extra sensitive for whatever reason. But casual use probably isn't going to have long-lasting impacts on the brain or other organ systems. What we're concerned about, though, as the acceptance of marijuana in its variety forms goes up, that the use pattern is going to go up as well. And I showed you the vaping data that suggests that's true, at least in the context of vaping. But if I look at just the overall use without breaking it down into the way the drug is being used, the annual use is fairly steady. So here you have 12th graders, and it's right around 5 to 6% and has been for the last 10 years. Now, as more and more states adopt marijuana, can we expect that use pattern to go up? Well, the vaping data says, yeah, we probably can, in as much as vaping is the principal mechanism by which individuals or adolescents are administering it. So this shouldn't make us feel so secure that, oh, we don't have to worry about legalizing it or making marijuana available through medical means. Our drug patterns are stable and they're not going to change or shift. Probably they are going to shift, and we need to pay attention to that in the future, especially with the adolescent population. Okay, let's step back a little bit and ask the question, why do adolescents get into trouble with these drugs? Why do they seem to be the most vulnerable and the most likely to use many of them, like alcohol, tobacco, marijuana? These are just some examples where the majority of individuals who are starting to use these drugs are adolescents. They're not adults. So what's going on here? Well, we know in adolescence, brain development is occurring, and it's very dynamic. It's changing in very rapid way, which impacts behavior. Those of you who have children or have been around children or have ever been a child, you know that the way children think is dramatically different from when they're 10 to when they're 12 or to when they're 14 or 16 or 18 or 21. They look very, very different. We sometimes say they grow up, which is a euphemism for saying their brain development accelerates and stabilizes. And so without going into a lot of detail, but what this little figure shows us is that the maturity pattern, red is something that's very mature, and there is an area here that's called the amygdala, and it's very much involved in reward, and red means that it's mature. So these reward areas, emotional areas, mature very early on in life, but this area, this frontal cortex piece, it's getting darker and darker as the individual gets older, and it's not mature until way out here into the 20s. And that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is important for decision making. So they don't become real adults as measured by decision making maturity until they're well into their 20s. So if addiction is a decision-making pathology, then one could argue that adolescents are in a pathological state of decision-making because they don't always make the best decisions in the world, and that makes them vulnerable to the problems with the drugs of abuse. Now, there are various levels of neurobiology that's going on here, and we don't have time to go through all of them. But let me just mention the 3 levels: brain morphology, the general structure, and that's what this shows you. The fiber architecture and the connectivity, and this is the fancy way of saying pathways. These are brain pathways. They're cells, neurons, brain cells, where their cell bodies start and where they end. So these are the communication wires, how different brain areas talk to other places in the brain, that connectivity. And then way down at the biochemical or endocrine levels, and when we talk about transmitters, we talk about dopamine and serotonin and other transmitters, it's at this level we're talking about. All 3 of these are changing, and they're changing dramatically during adolescence, which makes them vulnerable if you're taking drugs of abuse that affect the neurochemistry of these systems. Okay, let's take a look at some brain images. So these are MRIs looking from the side, and I want to introduce you to, if you've not discussed or you're not aware of these systems, to 3 general areas that make adolescents particularly vulnerable to drugs of abuse. And it also describes why adolescents behave the way they do. So first of all is the prefrontal cortex. I mentioned that. Its job is to integrate. So most of the brain areas project into the prefrontal cortex. It receives pathways from almost every brain area, in particular, the sensory cortex. So sensory cortex is involved in assessing what's happening in the environment and then projecting information to the prefrontal cortex so it can make decisions about one's environment. So it is what we call a go-no-go system, meaning it decides one behavior is appropriate, so it activates a behavior in response to what's happening around them, or it decides that a behavior is not appropriate and it puts the brakes on and it stops an impulse from happening that's going to get you into trouble. Below it is the orbital frontal cortex, and orbital frontal cortex talks a lot to prefrontal cortex, and what it does is it's all about priorities and motivation. It is our priority list. It tells us what's important and what isn't important. So you would expect the things that are at the top of the list are going to be the things that are going to motivate or stimulate the prefrontal cortex and help to direct it as to what behaviors are going to be go behaviors, are going to do them. So important in decision making as well. And then this is the limbic system. I don't know if you've ever heard that term before, but it's about emotions. So amygdala is here, and I used that term before. And another region that's associated with the amygdala is called the nucleus accumbens. So these 2 things are very important in rewards and perceived immediate needs. So they're very much about the here and the now. They are knee-jerk reactions. If you ever heard of fight or flight, a lot of the fight or flight responses come out of this amygdala area. So these are survival skills. And then, of course, these things talk to each other, and there's this major connecting pathway between prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So if prefrontal cortex is going to stop us, the no-go piece, from doing things that are going to get us into trouble, it needs to have a way to communicate to the amygdala, say, that's very impulsive, it's going to be a bad decision, you're going to regret it, so you shouldn't do it. And it should have the power to shut this thing down to keep your behavior under control and to keep you out of trouble in the process. So in the adolescent brain, there is inefficient control because of the development piece that I showed you. These systems have not matured yet, and they're still in the stage of trying to get to the point where they're functional and they're working at a high level, in a mature way. The adolescent saliency, or their priority list, is fouled up. Things that we consider to be mature priorities aren't in place yet in an adolescent. They're kind of fouled up because they're very much about stimulating their emotions or catering to their emotions, and they're very much about rewards and immediate rewards now, not about rewards in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. It's hard for them to project that far down the road. And then, as I showed you in that other slide, their reward system is very dominant. It's strong, even when they are children, young children. So the reward system directs them and overwhelms decision-making. So they're very much about satisfying that reward system. So if you look at this and you look at what drug addiction does to these systems, you find out it does the same thing. Drug addiction changes one's brain into looking like what it did when you were an adolescent. So these people behave like adolescents. If you've dealt with them, here you have an adult that's 30 or 40 years old, they're a meth addict or they're a heroin addict or whatever, and you say, this person behaves like they're 13 years old. Well, actually, they are 13 years old in terms of what their brain is doing, how it's working, because the continual exposure to these drugs has, in a way, turned them into what I call the Peter Pan syndrome. That is, they're back to Never Never Land of adolescence. And in a way, they're stuck there. Certainly, they're stuck there as long as they continue to use the drugs that put them back into the adolescent stage. So, adolescents, drug abuse, substance use disorder look very similar in terms of the overall neurobiology. Well, why would adolescence be a state of substance use disorder, neurobiology? I mean, it sounds like Mother Nature made a mistake when she put the brain together. Well, actually, turns out there is a reason to go through these stages. There is something or some things that are very important to the individual. For example, when you're growing up, you want to be trying new things. You want to experiment. And so they're very vulnerable, the adolescents, to stuff that thrills or daring behavior. Oh, they're all about trying something new. And sometimes trying something new can be healthy and exciting and expand your level of maturity and experience. But sometimes thrilling and daring can be very dangerous, especially if you're putting chemicals into your body to give you a sensation that you've never had before, but it can also leave effects that can be persistent and in some serious cases may even be permanent that you can never recover from. It turns out all mammals go through this phase of adolescence or experimentation, and there's been interesting literature that's out there. Some of the classic literature is written by a Dr. Linda Spears, and phylogenetically, which means all the various levels of mammal species, all of them have adolescence, and they all have this experimentation component, meaning their neurobiology looks fairly similar. It doesn't develop fully until they reach adulthood. Just happens that for humans, that period is from 13 to 26, and we call adolescence. We also call it trouble, but it is what it is. So the theory, high-risk attitude is necessary. But why? Well, it's necessary for a lot of reasons, but it's also socially necessary because as you mature and you get through adolescence and you go into young adulthood, there is a time when the individual is supposed to leave the family and go out on their own and try to do new things. And for some people, this is a very scary part of life. Others are more than anxious to do it because they're sort of risk takers, and this is exciting to be on your own and to get to succeed on your own and also get to fail on your own. But the neurobiology encourages this so that individuals will break off and form separate families. And that seems to be an important thing for sustaining and protecting the species. And not only do you go off and leave your family, but you start your own family, which seems even scarier to those of us who've had families and we're empty nesters at this point. We look back when we were in our early 20s or whenever we got married and we think, I can't believe I did that. I would never do that again. If I had known then what I know now. And fortunately, they don't know then what we know now, and their brains, even if they did know it, would probably ignore it because that's the way their brains are designed. And so that turns out to be a good thing, a high-risk thing, but a good thing. And then they try other new things like going and getting a job, taking risks to get ahead and to get promoted. Sometimes they don't succeed, but a lot of times they do. And it's exciting, it enriches the life experience. However, it also increases exposure to things that can do harm, such as drugs, and for a variety of coping reasons or reward reasons, and I'll give you some other reasons why they turn to drugs during this adolescent stage. So what are some of these factors for addiction? Well, one of the problems we see, and it's kind of, once you understand the neurobiology, it's fairly obvious that the earlier this brain gets exposed to these drugs, the more delicate it's going to be because it's in the early stages of development, and the more likely that it's going to be a serious complication and maybe even a permanent effect on how that brain develops. And it keeps an individual in that adolescent stage. Remember I said drugs of abuse tend to make brains look like adolescent brains. Well, if you put a drug of abuse on an adolescent brain, what it does is it keeps it in adolescence. Even though the rest of the body grows up, the brain doesn't grow up, and they get stuck into that adolescent stage even when they should be acting like adults. So it changes the development, and it does it in a variety of ways. And I'm going to just mention this because it's a topic all of its own. But genetics plays an important role here. Susceptibility. We oftentimes see families that tend to have a higher incidence of drug abuse issues. Some of that is probably environment, because some families have a really bad, high-stress environment, which would sort of drive, especially an adolescent, to using drugs to try to compensate. But some families have genetics that make them susceptible. And then there's another form of genetics, and I'm going to just throw this out in case you've ever heard this term or you run into it. It's called epigenetics, which means that these drugs can actually change genetic expression above and beyond what was there naturally, above and beyond the DNA that they received from their mothers and their fathers. These drugs can change the genetics, and we call that epigenetics, and sometimes these epigenetic changes can be long-term or they may even be permanent. So you've permanently altered the genetics or the expression of the genetics in an individual. So these are kind of scary things when you contemplate how potent the interaction between a brain and these drugs are, especially during the adolescence period. These drugs can aggravate mental illness, and so about 50–60% of those who have substance use disorder also have mental illness superimposed, and in fact it may be the mental illness that brings them to the drug in the first place. They were self-medicating something like a lot of stress, or a lot of pain, or other legitimate, and that term I use loosely, but a lot of legitimate complaints, medical complaints, and they used these illicit drugs, or they got their hands on, they diverted prescription drugs to self-medicate these mental illness symptoms, and then continue use of the drug turns into SUD, a substance use disorder. And then, as I said, the environment is going to have an impact as well. Unstable families, relationships, high stress, abuse. Abuse is a variety of exposures. It can be physical, emotional, sexual, stress, high stress in their lives. These also tend to draw them to these drugs during adolescence. So there are a lot of reasons why it's happening. So you can see why we would use the term that addiction can be a developmental disease, because so many of the people that have SUD did begin exposure to the drug when they were adolescents and during developmental stages. Now, we talked about prefrontal. Just kind of take a look at that. We're sort of running out of time, so we won't spend a lot of time here, other than I want to mention this particular component. And if you follow the literature, especially adolescent literature and abuse discussions, you know that cortisol, which is a steroid, comes out of the adrenal glands, is a stress hormone, and individuals get exposed to high stress, especially during development, end up with continual exposure to high cortisol in their bloodstream. That goes to their brain, and cortisol, a continual exposure to cortisol, will change the way the brain develops. So here's a neurobiological explanation for why these drugs can affect the development of the brain because of the stress linkage, and things such as hormone releases, such as cortisol or the steroids. Other factors, peers and school. Peers are very important to adolescents, what people think. And the friends and acquaintances, if they're encouraging you to use these drugs, you're much more likely to use them as an adolescent. But if you're in an environment where your peers and acquaintances, their attitudes are against drugs, then you're much less likely to use these drugs. And if you follow the Monitoring the Future survey literature, they have a whole section that talks about perceived harmfulness of drugs in adolescence. And they will ask the seniors, the 10th graders, 8th graders, what is your perception of the harmfulness of marijuana or cocaine or methamphetamine or alcohol or whatever? And they find that if they see an increase in the positive perception of a drug or a group of drugs, very soon thereafter, like the next year or next couple of years, the use pattern will go up. So perception predicts use. And not a surprise, because we know that perception is about peers and about attitudes, and adolescents are very vulnerable to both of these, especially when they come from the peers. So if your peers abuse, and those individuals who have few risk factors other than they're constantly in this environment where their peers are encouraging them to use, they're more likely to try drugs for the first time. So that environment has a great impact. Home and family. Sometimes I think we underestimate the impact that home and family can have. We think, oh yeah, the peers will win out all the time. And that doesn't seem to be what research tells us. Research tells us that the home and the family, even though they might not always be hugging and kissing each other, there is a lot of power in an environment, a home and family environment, that discourages drug use and provides opportunities for healthy decision-making to their children. This just sort of summarizes what we're talking about there. Parents or older family members who abuse drugs or engage in criminal behavior will increase the risks, and the opposite is true as well. Those that don't do those things will protect against drug use. So look to the homes, train the parents, try to create an environment for these adolescents to grow up in that will sustain and strengthen them. These folks oftentimes, as I mentioned, can use these drugs for relief, particularly relief that has to do with anxiety and stress, depression. Everybody experiences stress, but in the adolescent stage, that stress seems to be more intense and they have fewer coping skills. They haven't quite figured out how to deal with the stress of peer pressures, or the stress of schools, or the stress of parents, or the stress of expectations in society. And so they may turn to drugs that have sedative properties like alcohol or other sedative agents. Even the opioids are sedatives of some sort. Or marijuana is a sedative. They use these things to lessen their stress feelings, and it's part of their coping skills. And they don't know how to manage that, and they overuse and they get into trouble, and it leads to an SUD. Another thing that helps them to turn, or encourages them to turn to drugs, is performance. Performance is a very critical thing for all of us. We all want to do well, no matter what the context, but adolescents particularly, they're very conscious about how they present themselves and what everybody thinks about them. And so performance is critical, whether it's athletic performance or it's test taking and qualifying exams. There's a lot of pressure on our students at all levels to do well, and drugs are thought by some to enhance cognition, especially if you're sleepy. You want to put in an all-nighter preparing for an exam, and so you may turn to a stimulant to help you do that. If you do it over and over and over again, it starts to become a way of life. And this little cartoon that says, have you noticed the only colleges he's applying to are in Washington and in Colorado? As you may know, marijuana is legal in Washington and Colorado. So the inference is, there is a link between behavior and the fact that this person has relied on a drug, marijuana in this case, to get through school, or at least they think they have. So let me just go through quickly the pattern. And as I said, the pattern is different in each person as to how they got there to the substance use disorder. But there are certain elements that seem to be fairly similar and repeated regularly. First of all, oftentimes they start off and they view the use of the drug as being positive. And if you talk to them early on, they always say, I've got this under control. You know, I use it, but I control it. I'm not worried about it getting out of control. For example, maybe the introduction is pain management. So they're using it not only as prescribed, but they're using it more than prescribed. But they're convinced that they can handle it and it's not going to be a problem for them. As they use it more and more, and the doses go up because tolerance sometimes occurs with these drugs, and the frequency of using it goes up, again, because of tolerance, or maybe the pain that they're treating is the degenerative pain, so that the pain itself increases. So now they're using more and more of it, and there are some changes that are occurring in the body, and some of those changes may be permanent, especially if they're using it during adolescence when brain is developing, or others may be temporary. If you can get them off the drug, those effects will go away. The pleasure, which oftentimes occurs early on for many people, but not all. Some people find these drugs very dysphoric and unpleasant. I've heard many times someone say, I used codeine for my third molar extractions and I hated it. I can't understand why anyone would ever use this stuff. It was very unpleasant. But I've heard others, a lot of others say, that felt so good. I'm going to get all my teeth out so I can have the drug. I mean, they're exaggerating, at least I hope they're exaggerating. But pleasure, though, eventually gets replaced by compulsion. The pleasure is there early on, but they use the drug over and over, and now it becomes a compulsive behavior. And remember, dopamine, I said, is involved with pleasure, and so we think that's one of the reasons that it's a primary target of these drugs. but it is also involved with compulsive behavior developing. And we're saying here that the process of SUD in most patients or individuals goes from pleasure causing to compulsive behavior causing, both of which are dopamine related functions. So you see, dopamine story is fairly complicated. It's not just about reward and pleasure. So they go from pleasure to compulsion, and you'll commonly hear them say, well, you know, I don't get that much pleasure out anymore. I'm just more interested in feeling normal. And so they're compulsive in that behavior to try to feel what normal used to feel like and what everybody else feels. Tolerance, I talked to you about how it plays a role in the escalation. And then almost without exception, all of these drugs, because you become so tolerant and physically dependent on them, when you try to take them away, you try to quit, they have withdrawal, and that withdrawal can be very, very intense, like with alcohol or with the opioids. It can be painful, difficult, and even dangerous, and in extreme cases, it might even be life-threatening. So withdrawal isn't simply a nuisance for many patients. It's very, very serious. So the marijuana model, we've touched on most of these things, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. We talked about the common use and how that use is going up. Marijuana, is it addictive? You can kind of take a look at these on your own. We talked about 6% of the high school students, they use it according to the Monitoring the Future. But the sooner they start getting exposed to marijuana, the greater the likelihood it will be addictive. It'll cause a substance use disorder, or what we call MUD, marijuana use disorder. 9% of these earlier users will be addicted to marijuana. So that's a fairly high percent. It's not that unusual to see a 9% of those users of a drug go on to addiction, and marijuana fits into that as well. Just some pieces here. Marijuana use does have an impact. It can affect attention, motivation. Those that use it regularly tend to get lower grades in the adolescent. Look at this one here. Over 3,000 adolescents use marijuana for the first time every day in this country. So tell me that it doesn't have the potential for causing dependence and or addiction. So we're very concerned about what that's going to look like in the future. And then, are there long-term consequences? There's some studies saying that if you use it regularly, that you may actually damage your IQ. 8 points was one study. There is some discussion as to how much of an impact it has, but I think everybody acknowledges it will have an impact. It just does. Drugs like this, you use them during adolescence, they're going to change the way the brain develops. That's just basic neurobiology. It doesn't, whether you're pro-marijuana or you're anti-marijuana, it's just neurobiology. Forms of consumption, I'll let you kind of look that over yourself. There are a variety of different ways you can administer marijuana. Their pharmacology can vary. See the vaporizing I mentioned before? We know that that's almost doubling those who are vaping marijuana. So here's a case that shows that by vaping this drug, you're getting something different that you don't seem to be getting in other forms of administration. And that should be of concern to us. Brain effects, again, I'll let you go through that. Some of these are pretty well known in terms of affecting movement. Your reflexes are impaired. Your memory is impaired with the use of this drug. Don't know a lot about pregnancy. It's there, but what we are seeing is more pregnant women are using it because they think it's medical marijuana and it's not going to be a problem. And I think that's a very dangerous assumption to make. We do know that it can have all kinds of mental effects, particularly interacting with the paranoia, schizophrenia, individuals who have schizophrenia problems. The literature is pretty strong that if you have underlying tendencies towards schizophrenia and you use marijuana, it can pull it out. And the same thing goes with depression or affective disorders. And then the addiction, we talked about that, and I'll let you look at that. It does have withdrawals. It is the sedative, And so the withdrawals look very much like a sedative withdrawal. That is, they're irritable, problems with sleeping, tend to have more anxiety, and the cravings exist there. Well, the bottom line is brains get rewired by drug use, and when the brain is doing wiring anyway because it's an adolescent brain and it's trying to develop pathways, that rewiring that the drug use causes will come back to hurt you and have an impact. And I mentioned this already, and that is that mental illness and addictive behaviors interact or comorbid. And so if you're trying to deal with an addictive behavior, you better pay attention to what's going on mentally, because if you address one without the other, you're likely to be a failure and the outcomes are likely to fail. I'm going to let you look at this kind of on your own. The bottom line is most people, when they enter treatment for SUD, will have some kind of a mental health problem, but it is different according to the age. So here about, I said 60% or so, this study said around 70%. But you can see here the younger ones are more likely that abuse drugs are more likely to have conduct disorder, whereas older users are more likely to have things such as mood disorders and depression. So take a look at that on your own, but the bottom line is the same. Prevention, we are about prevention, and prevention in adolescence is particularly problematic. And as you look at the reasons here, you see some trends. One is you're dealing with peer pressure oftentimes. You're trying to prevent, it's sort of like you're pushing against the dam to try to convince an adolescent they shouldn't be doing something when all their buddies are doing it. For them, their perception is very critical, and when the whole community or the whole country is viewing something as not being a negative, then they're going to buy into it, and it's going to be hard to convince them you shouldn't do it because it's problematic. And then oftentimes they're just not motivated. So you can sit there and explain all the science to them and they understand it, but if they don't have the motivation, they're not going to do much. So we're kind of out of time here, and let me just wrap it up. And again, I'm going to sort of let you go through this on your own. One is a 12-step program for adolescents. And what I wanted, the lesson I want to put across here is that you tend to deal with adolescent SUD in a different way than you do with adult. So if you look at these various elements in this 12-step piece, you realize there are some significant different strategies in things that you're trying to go after. For example, impulse control, number one for adolescents because they're very impulsive. So you'll see these things, they sort of emphasize what you see in adolescents, that it may not be as big a deal with the adult. And then I'll also let you take a look at motivational interviewing because that's another strategy we oftentimes use. If you can change the motivation of these kids, these adolescents, then you're halfway there in terms of trying to convince them using a substance or substances is not a good idea, especially if you can convince them it's their own idea not to use it. So you want to get their involvement in whatever you do relative to motivational development. And then let you look at the parent take-home summary. How does a parent get involved in dealing with their children? They have the opportunity to create activities that are healthy and anti-drugs. They have the ability to reinforce good, healthy decision-making, and they also have the opportunity to encourage good lifestyles that are going to promote good brain behavior. So, there is no cure, whether you're an adult or you're an adolescent, but treatment typically will require behavior, occasionally medication. Even in adolescence, you'd really like to catch the problem early on. You'd like to prevent it or have an early intervention, which would require less medication. But if it gets well entrenched, medication may be necessary. And then research is helping us to understand why these things are happening and what sorts of approaches, behavioral approaches in particular, can affect or encourage healthy brain development during adolescence, which will discourage drug use and then ultimately a happier, healthier life free of drugs and the consequences of drug damage to one's brain. All right, thank you very much. Hopefully this has been of some value to you. I encourage you to come back and look at the slides, some of the stuff we went through quickly and pick that up. But the bottom line, neurobiology is important. Adolescents are high risk, and we know that, but there is an explanation, and there are ways to help these adolescents get through their adolescence successfully and come out at the other end as an adult drug-free. Thank you very much. Let me just mention in the wrap up, our next webinar, which is the last of the series, will be given by Dr. Jason Burrow-Sanchez, and this will be June 4th. And it is entitled Vaping Among Adolescents. So I've already kind of given you an introduction to the idea that it is a problem. Dr. Burrow-Sanchez will talk about that problem and some of the things we can do to address it and certainly to understand it. You can see here the website for registering for that. So I invite you to join us again for that final webinar that has to do with the adolescent topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. We'll just take 1 minute for questions. We had a question asked in the chat a little earlier by Randy Berglund. They asked, when you say casual usage, what do you mean by that? What is the frequency and the amount?
So Randy, when I use a term like casual, you've got to appreciate that it is very context sensitive. So casual for someone, maybe they use it once a day, or they use it once a week, or they use it once a month. For someone else, it could be less frequent use. I used it once in my life. That was casual. But the principle is the fewer times you get exposed to the drug, the less likely it is that it's going to cause problems for you. If you're healthy, if you have underlying issues, then casual is going to be much less, at least the non-toxic, non-damaging casual is going to be much, much less, and probably the best casual is not at all. So just keep that in mind. The reason I threw the concept out is that these drugs, for some people, probably, or the majority of people, probably won't do anything because most people are typically casual and they're relatively healthy. But those other folks that they're very vulnerable, very susceptible to drugs like marijuana or tobacco or alcohol, and even a casual use could be disastrous for them.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hansen. We'll wrap it up for today, but remember to do the GPRA evaluation. For those of you who have a QR code scanner, you could scan that right now, or the link to the GPRA survey is on the slide and also in the chat. For any previous webinars from our series, please visit our website, pttcnetwork.org/Mountain Plains. And if you follow those instructions, click the 3 lines, which will pull down that gray box, and then choose on-demand webinars. You can find them there or under products. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Have a great day.